Testing, testing. Okay.
Okay, we're ready to begin. Acting Dean of the Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies, Dr. Harold McDermott. Head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Warwick Latibadier. Honorary guest, Mrs. Hilory Pamela Kelly. Dr. Novlet McLean Francis, Senior Education Officer and Curriculum Specialist. Esteemed faculty, distinguished guests, lecturers, students, and or online audience, good afternoon. We would also like to extend special welcome to Dr. Joseph Ferguson, Coordinator of Jamaica Language Unit at UWI-Mona. Today we host the 10th staging of the Hilory Pamela Kelly Lecture under the theme From Colonialism to the 21st Century, focusing on Creoles in Caribbean National Curricula. I am Janelle Dezzoni.
And I am Amari Wilson, and will be your host for this afternoon's proceedings.
We kindly ask that you hold on to your questions until the end of the presentations, as we have reserved a special time for questions and answers.
Mrs. Kelly first started the Self-Access Learning Center, which was aimed at providing a safe space where students could gain confidence in expressing themselves in writing and speech, both in English and Jamaican Creole. This annual lecture is held in her honor. Her tenure at the university can be described as pioneering and visionary. Today is a special and significant day for the LTRC department, as today marks a decade since the Hilory Pamela Kelly Distinguished Lecture has been taking place here at the University of Technology, Jamaica. This lecture seeks to embrace linguistic awareness, resilience, and inclusion, as Mrs. Kelly firmly believes in fairness and inclusivity, which the lecture aims to promote. In keeping with the theme of this afternoon's lecture, through the Language Teaching Research Center, our esteemed university recently introduced a remarkable addition to its course offerings by now offering the Jamaican Creole as an elective to students.
We open the program with Dr. Warwick Latibadier, who will be bringing the opening remarks. Dr. Latibadier.
Dr. Harold McDermott, Acting Dean, Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies, Dr. Deidre Telfer, Director, Language Teaching and Research Center, Mrs. H. Pamela Kelly, and all your guests, the USA, Canada, the Edgars, also Dr. Leonie Harris, your close friend, Dr. Novlet Francis McLean, guest speaker and senior education officer, Ministry of Education and Youth, and all your guests online, your education officers, Charlotte Comack, Cecile Young, Tina Marsh, Harris. Also Sadfo Bennett, Assistant Chief Education Officer, Dr. Clover Hamilton Flowers, Acting Deputy Chief Education Officer, Curriculum Support Services, Dr. Joseph Ferguson. Welcome to everyone. The 9th staging of the Hilory Pamela Kelly Distinguished Lecture was an immense success, held both virtually and in person exactly almost a year ago on Thursday, January 26, 2023, right here at the UTech JA Papine campus. The LTRC, the Language Teaching and Research Center, an arm of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies, is proud to once more be the hub of this legacy in its 10th iteration. A homage pair to Mrs. Kelly, one who has become immortalized with the language and literary eminence now captured in this event on critical scholarship of academic literacy and language education. As head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and as a current public orator, I have been trailing you, Mrs. Kelly, the retired public orator. So when asked by the director of the LTRC, Dr. Telfer, with primary oversight in planning this event in the school, I considered the privilege doubly mine to do the opening remarks in my role as head of school for this event so timely and, might I add, fortuitous, for I just assumed this position of head of school just 3 weeks ago. In the school, languages have always been at the heart of the humanities and the social. The school embraces the evolution of languages much as the Self-Access Learning Center founded by Mrs. Kelly to aid students and staff in language education evolved into the Language Teaching and Research Center, now with its 10th staging of this distinguished lecture. In the branch of knowledge that deals with interpretation, especially of the Bible and literary texts, called hermeneutics, the number 10 is a number denoting fullness, entirety, the aggregate, the sum of all that exists of something. It is with this fulsomeness of impact that we approach this 10th staging, that we hope to continue after this in perpetuum memoriam of what Mrs. Kelly has done. This year's theme, from colonialism to the 21st century Creoles in Caribbean national curricula, tests the limits of language, Creoles, and invite scholarship and discourse with impact at the national level. And what better thing than for us, the school, to partner with the Ministry of Education and Youth. And so pleased we are to have our guest speaker indeed, Dr. Novelet Francis McLean. A warm welcome to all indeed. And as we think of colonialism to the 21st century, we envision a ship, but also a language scholarship. So all aboard, we expect. We encourage all hands on deck for a journey on this Creole ship that has now docked into our harbor. May the knowledge that today's proceedings generate move us to will and to act, filling our consciousness in a manner of the waters that cover the very sea. Again, the privilege is once again doubly mine to bring opening remarks.
Dr. Latibadir said, we envision a ship, but also a language scholarship. Thank you, Dr. Latibadir.
At this time, we invite the Acting Dean, Dr. Harold McDermott, to bring greetings.
Masters of Ceremonies, Ms. Dezoni, Mr. Wilson, Distinguished Honoree, Mrs. Kelly, SHS Head of School, Dr. Warwick Latibodier, Director of the LTRC, Dr. Deidre Telfer, our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Francis McLean, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, all, a pleasant good afternoon. It is my duty and my pleasure to bring greetings on behalf of the Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies. But before I do so, I'd just like to register the apologies of Acting Vice President Professor Sherman Barrett for not being able to be here. We all know that on occasions like these, Professor Barrett is always present. This time she had an engagement that took her away, but she extended her best wishes for the event, and I am pleased to pass those on. Derek Walcott, Nobel laureate, academic, and Caribbean man of letters, once wrote, "To change your language, you must change your life." Here, the distinguished laureate is pointing to the inextricable nexus between linguistic expression and lived experience, including ways of receiving, perceiving, and understanding the world. The Language Teaching and Research Center here in the Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies gladly accepts, via the distinguished Pamela Kelly lecture, our mandate to sensitize and educate members of the UTEC Academy and the wider Jamaican public of the crucial role that language has historically played in colonizing the worldview of subject peoples across the globe, and counter-discursively, the pivotal role that language can play and is playing through post-coloniality in decolonizing the mind. We eagerly await our guest speakers' elucidation of this important topic. It is therefore my signal honor as Acting Dean of the Faculty this afternoon, through the Language Teaching and Research Center, to welcome you to this our annual grounding on issues of language, grounding which has traditionally included reflections, sharing, and even debate. And if in the process the discourse veers towards polemic, so that we may even have occasion to dress each other down in an academic and polite way, of course, that is okay too. Because language does not only give facility to describe and explain the world around us, but it is also the very vehicle that we use to talk about language. This is what we refer to as the meta-language function. We thank Dr. Deidre and her dedicated team for staging this year's event, and I encourage everyone within the hearing of my voice to register for the Jamaican language module, JAM 3001. Only then can we truly say, like Ted Chamberlain, "Come back to me, my language." Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Harold McDermott.
At this time, we are going to be handing over to Dr. Eraldine Shakespeare, Coordinator of Fells Graduate Studies, Research and Entrepreneurship, who will be introducing and speaking a little about Mrs. Hilory Kelly. Mrs. Shakespeare.
Thank you so very much. Good evening, beautiful people. So mine is the pleasure to introduce my, selfish, my Mrs. Hilory Pamela Kelly. Why do I say my? In 1997, I entered the University of Technology, Jamaica, and one of my first lecturers was Mrs. Kelly. And she taught me that even though I was in an environment of higher education, there were still nurturing teachers there, yes? And then, so I'm going personal before I go deep. And then we journeyed together as she tried to soften my abrasiveness. She's still working on it, right, Mrs. Kelly? So, good, nice, ice broken. Good afternoon, everyone. All protocols observed. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, and students. Today we gather in the spirit of academic celebration and continuity to introduce and acknowledge an extraordinary educator whose life's work has illuminated the path of knowledge and definitely has left an indelible mark on education. It is my distinct pleasure and my privilege to introduce to you Mrs. Hilory Pamela Kelly, a beacon of inspiration whose illustrious career is marked by a constellation of achievements. Mrs. Kelly has not only left an indelible mark on the institution she served and continues to serve, I might add, but has also been a guiding force in shaping the educational landscape of Jamaica. Her journey in education is a testament to her unwavering dedication and exceptional service. Recognized with the prestigious Prime Minister's Award for Excellence in 2013 for her unparalleled contributions to education, she has seamlessly blended nurturing teaching methodologies with appropriate, I am so sorry, technology does demand you and pull you in many different directions. She has seamlessly blended nurturing teaching methodologies with appropriate, andragogically grounded methods that allow for students to feel both cared for and respected. She has a passion for creating safe spaces that are conducive to learning. Her sterling service at UTech Jamaica, particularly with an outstanding rapport with students, paints a vivid picture of her commitment to fostering an environment where education flourishes. Now, rest assured, she was good with everybody, but it doesn't matter how hard, how strong, how difficult the gentlemen were who entered her class. She had a way of making sure that they left really as gentlemen. She had a way of taming the wild, of softening the hard, and of course, smoothing out all the rough edges. She had patience that can't be paid for, can't be measured. She was really, really accommodating. And later on, when I started to work with her, she was my supervisor for a number of years. She had a way of calming me because I had a way of not being so calm. In situations that I thought were a bit unfair, she would say, "Come now, Mrs. Shakespeare, let us look at the tone." And she would, especially when I wrote, she would say, "Come, let me check the tone." So she really, really is a nurturing spirit. And it's not just a matter of cushioning you, but it's of also challenging you to prepare you for the world out there. So a true country girl at heart, Mrs. Kelly's humility is a hallmark of her character. Despite a career adorned with accolades, including her role as a judge for the Norman Manley Foundation's essay competitions, and her outstanding service to the Lions Club of St. Andrew, she remains soft-spoken, unassuming, and a lady of few words. Yes, an orator can be a lady of few words. Her impact reverberates with timely and impactful words of wisdom, often tinged with a wry sense of humor and a twinkle in her eyes. So, a proud Wolmerian, yes, she lifts up her head at this point. A proud Wolmerian, Mrs. Kelly's professional journey commenced at St. Hugh's High School for Girls, where she spent 15 years crafting a legacy of innovation and inspiration. initiating Jamaica's first student book rental system. Major, you know. Innovating the first book rental system, establishing a mentorship program for staff, and rising to the position of vice principal. Mrs. Kelly laid the groundwork for her enduring impact. Her entrepreneurial spirit flourished at Target English, where alongside her lifelong friend, Dr. Leonie Harris, she dedicated a decade to teaching English to a diverse audience. For over 25 years, the University of Technology Jamaica has been blessed to have Mrs. Kelly on staff. Her instrumental role in establishing the Self-Access Communication Learning Center, coupled with her exceptional service as university orator, showcases the depth of her knowledge, skills, and professional attitude, which conveys her dynamic personal capacity, to bring about positive change. As senior lecturer, she served on numerous faculty and curriculum boards, showcasing her innovative teaching strategies, and has been a trusted consultant to prestigious institutions worldwide. The establishment of the Hilory Pamela Kelly Lecture, proposed by Dr. Harold McDermott, received resounding endorsement from faculty and management here at UTech. And this is a testament to the profound impact Mrs. Kelly has had on her academic community. The Learning and Teaching Resource Center stands as a lasting testament to her unstinting service and her dedication to excellence. Beyond her professional endeavors, Mrs. Kelly remains devoted to family and friends, embodying the Woolmerian motto, Age Quaregis, whatever you do, do it well. She is not only a distinguished educator, but a cherished mother of 3 boys and a grandmother to 3 grandchildren, plus my 3, so she's an auntie-grandmother, who are her pride and joy. Now, in the presence of our distinguished lecturer, Dr. McLean Francis, and amidst the warmth of colleagues, friends, and students, I am honored to present to you the epitome of educational excellence, compassion, and grace, Mrs. Hilory Pamela Kelly. May her legacy continue to inspire generations to come. Thank you.
Good afternoon, distinguished ladies, gentlemen, students, friends. I'm so glad that Mrs. Shakespeare pointed out that I was a person of few words. It has set me free. It has set me free. And I'm so happy that she didn't actually expose any of our early secrets which we had together. As a grandmother, I continue to read to my granddaughter now because the others are big people going there, or at least I think so. But just last time I was reading something from Dr. Seuss for them. How did it get so late so soon? It's night before it's afternoon. December is here before it's June. My goodness, how the time has flown. How did it get so late so soon? It's hard to imagine that 10 years have passed since you first did me the honor of establishing this eponymous lecture. I must tell you, I had to go and look it up. So where did the years go? I'm happy that you have continued at UTech to use the occasion to bring together people of like minds to explore issues related not only to research and language learning, but to meet the many challenges which have arisen and will continue to arise in this era of social media, ChatGPT, and constant change. I'm so happy to hear about JAM 3001. And I want you to expose it a little more, because I have some students at UTech now, and I start my classes with talking about the Jamaican language situation, and they tell me it can't be taught. They've never heard of it being taught. So I hope that you'll really advertise it and let them know that it is a language in itself and that it can be taught. So I thank you again for all the very kind words that you have offered this evening and in the years past, and for acknowledging my very small part in this ongoing effort, which you continue to take to new and greater heights. In accepting this honor, I ask you to give some thought and indeed recognition to the many colleagues who contributed to the effort. I'm thinking in particular of the late Dr. Ray Davis, who, having caught the vision, provided the budget from which the center was first set up. Mrs. Lily Samuels and Dr. Meret Newman, former members of the department, who sat with me in the Oval Office, supporting my nervous and halting request to Dr. Davies, to Dr. Hodlin, then head of the faculty, and the colleagues, a few of them who continue to serve, like Grace and Loy over there, a few of them who were here, and also to Dr. Eraldine Shakespeare, now Dr. Eraldine Shakespeare, who as a youthful student and first graduate, assisted me in creating the activities and supporting the large number of students who visited the center in the first 10 years of its existence. With them, I share this honor. Thanks to all the friends, family members, and colleagues who have supported the lecture over the years, ensuring that neither I nor the organizations were too badly embarrassed. Sadly, over time, these have become fewer. Some have passed on. Others have succumbed to weakening knees, weakening hips or eyes, or whose courage fails with the thought of encountering the aptly named weapons of mass destruction as they venture on the city's roads. Happily, most can still hear, and thanks to COVID, have mastered the Zoom or YouTube platforms. I thank them for joining us online, even as I thank you all for having taken the time to be here in person. We can all agree that colonialism has had a profound effect, not only on our language in the Caribbean, but also on our societal structures. I believe that while some of our Caribbean neighbors have managed to integrate Creole languages into their curricula, in some measure at least, others, like ours perhaps, in spite of some efforts, are still facing the challenges of recognition of Creoles and their importance as an area that could foster a more inclusive and equitable educational environment. I look forward to understanding where we are in this regard and how the onslaught of AI will affect its further integration, if this is part of the aim. And therefore thanking Dr. McLean Francis for agreeing to share with us on this interesting topic, and look forward to a stimulating presentation and discussion. Thanks to you, Dr. McLean, for coming. And interestingly, we have been remaking our acquaintance because we worked together long ago when she was young and I had a few darker hair. Thanks again to all who continue to plan and execute this lecture each year. The Language Teaching and Research Center, its director, the head of school, the dean of the Faculty of Education, Liberal Studies, and all the people who have put in their great effort. I really do appreciate it. To all who have taken the time to celebrate this special occasion, I am blessed, I know, to have once again been afforded the privilege of seeing and being with you all in person. Indeed, I feel as special as Harry and Meghan must have felt last evening. Of course, without the fear of being upbraided for hobnobbing with those of you who wish to remove yourselves from the monarchy. Thank you all so much for coming. I look forward to the lecture.
After listening to Dr. Shakespeare and Mrs. Kelly, I think I can speak for all of us younger ones in here when I say I wish I had the opportunity to experience Mrs. Kelly as a lecturer and mentor. Thank you so much, Dr. Shakespeare, and our honorary guest, Mrs. Pamela Kelly.
It is an honor to have a distinguished guest speaker with us today. Ms. Shalika Boris, a lecturer from the Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies, will now introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much. Distinguished and specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Meet Dr. Novelette McLean Francis, a dedicated and accomplished professional with a deep passion for language education and curriculum development. Her journey began at the St. Joseph's Teachers College, where a diploma in teaching ignited a lifelong pursuit of knowledge. This spark blossomed into a master's degree in linguistics from the University of the West Indies, Mona, in 1997. Furthering her quest for practical expertise, Dr. McLean Francis earned an advanced certificate in educational management from Mount St. Vincent University in Canada and a certificate in testing evaluation in second language teaching from the International Languages Teacher Training Institute in Malaysia. With an unwavering commitment to excellence, Dr. McLean Francis has made significant contributions at every stage of her career. As a classroom teacher and later a senior education officer at the Ministry of Education and Youth, she amassed extensive experience in designing, developing, and implementing curricula for both primary and secondary levels. Her leadership in the National Standards Curriculum Project has transformed education pathways across Jamaica. Driven by a passion for knowledge, Dr. McLean Francis actively researches trends and practices in language education, ensuring curricula remains current and impactful. She has authored and co-authored several texts and articles culminating in her 2021 PhD thesis in linguistics from the University of the West Indies, Mona, with a focus on evolving currents and models in official language education policy in Jamaica, 1947 to 2018. This stands as a valuable resource for policymakers and educators alike. Dr. McLean Francis understands the importance of inspiring teachers. She regularly provides in-service training, coaching, and guidance to deliver effective language instruction. And beyond her impressive qualifications, Dr. McLean Francis is a passionate communicator, a collaborative leader, and a lifelong learner. Dr. Novelette McLean Francis is a true champion of language education. Her dedication, expertise, and leadership have made her a valuable asset to Jamaica's education system, a respected figure in the wider Caribbean community, and the ideal guest lecturer to engage us in a vital conversation from colonialism to the 21st century. Creoles in the Caribbean National Curricula. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Novelet McLean Francis.
Good afternoon, everyone. When technology fails, all right, but I will resort to the replacement. It is my pleasure to participate in the 10th annual Hilory Pamela Kelly Distinguished Lecture. Indeed, my pleasure. And I would like to acknowledge our Masters of Ceremonies, Ms. Dezoni and Mr. Wilson, Dr. Warwick Latibadair, Head of School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Harold McDermott, Acting Dean, Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies, and also Dr. Eraldine Williams Shakespeare, Acting Graduate Studies Coordinator, Faculty of Education and Liberal Studies. Our honoree, Mrs. Pamela Kelly, Hilory Pamela Kelly. It is indeed a pleasure after a number of years. And a little while I'll tell you how Mrs. Kelly impacted me very briefly. Also, Miss Shalika Boris, who made the introduction. Thank you so much. I would like to also acknowledge online, all our online guests at this time, including my bosses, Dr. Clover Hamilton Flores, Head of the Division, Curriculum and Support Services, my immediate boss, Mr. Sadfor Bennett, Assistant Chief Education Officer of the, Core Curriculum Unit, but he also at present gives oversight to the Technical and Vocational Unit, and my teammates from the Language Section, Mrs. Charlotte Comock, Miss Cecile Young, and Mrs. Tanya Marsh Harris. So welcome everybody, other distinguished guests that are here from different faculties or across the faculties. I also want to acknowledge, sorry, I almost left out Dr. Deidre Telfer, Director of the Language Teaching and Research Center, who has worked with her team, Ms. Andrea Miller, and also Ms. Patricia Pencil to coordinate, or Patrice Pencil to coordinate this very, very important event. So thank you all. So it is indeed my pleasure, Dr. Farquharson, Joseph Farquharson, from the University of the West Indies, my former dean, and also the coordinator of the Jamaica Language Unit. Welcome. And if Professor Devonish, Hubert Devonish, is also watching, I want to specially recognize Professor Devonish and other lecturers from the University of the West Indies. So I hope I haven't left out anybody. I had everything lined out here, but my technology has failed. So welcome all. Welcome everyone. Okay, so this is not all right. So we will be getting it together. Understand that this is not coming up either, but we are going to go ahead. I don't know what is happening. It's plugged in. Okay, so as Murphy's Law says, if anything will go wrong, it will. All right, so I don't know, but you can continue touching. I don't know what's going on. All right, so I really wanted you to have the visuals, but something is happening here with the system. It's just not coming up. I don't know what's going on. This is so unusual. All right, so we are going to go on with our topic, or presentation. And to begin the presentation, I will have to begin with the British Empire for us to understand where we're coming from. I'd also like to point out that this presentation, despite its wide topic, is delimited to CARICOM, the CARICOM Caribbean. And I will not be looking at all countries in the CARICOM Caribbean in the interest of time, but we will be focusing on Jamaica, the National Standards Curriculum, and moving to look briefly at Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, the Bahamas, and Barbados. All right, so that's where my study will be limited. Now, the British Empire in the 18th, well, starting from the 15th century onwards, extended right across the globe. All right, so the map is coming up. I would like you to look at it. So really, it was really a presence across the world. You're seeing it. So all those areas that are in pink are those areas in which we had British dominance. So you're seeing the West Indies, because they're so small, you may not be seeing them, but Jamaica is well there in pink. We can see Turks and Caicos, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, St. Lucia. Then we can see British Guyana. Further up there, you're seeing Canada. Then we go to Africa, you're seeing Nigeria, Egypt, and we could go on India, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand. So the British presence was indeed powerful. It was a strong presence across the world. And how then did Caribbean Creoles develop? Now, when I did my research, I realized that I learned something new, and I think that was something that nobody paid attention to. That language policy and the curricula that we have today all began with the setting up of what was known as a colonial university, the University of the West Indies. So with British dominance across the world, they set up several colonial universities. But as we know, the University College of the West Indies, which later became the University of the West Indies, was specifically set up in the British West Indies to help the new colonies as they prepared them for independence, to be adequately to be prepared, to have the necessary skills to manage themselves as independent nations. But the setting up of this colonial university was the catalyst for the change in education. So as you can see next, wonder what is happening again. Are you seeing? No? Okay. All right, so what happened next was that the Caribbean Creoles, so we had the plantation system happening. There are different theories of the development. Okay, you're seeing it now? No? Still on that slide? Okay. All right. So there are many theories of Creole genesis or Creole development, but I will keep it very simple here. So we're looking at the West African coastal pidgins. Many people believe that that's where Creoles really started, and that these pidgins came to the plantations with the slaves, and they developed with the European languages to give us Caribbean Creoles. There are others who believe that full-fledged African languages, not pidgins, but languages, interacted with European languages to produce Caribbean Creole. So I've included both because I believe that many times the absolutes are not necessarily correct. So it is possible that we had the influence of the pidgins, the trade languages on the West Coast, and we also had full-fledged languages. And so when those came together with the European languages, and in this case, I'm focusing on English, or the English dialects that came with the planters and other whites who came to the West Indies on the plantations. Via those interactions between and among slaves and among whites and everything, the resulting thing was Caribbean Creoles. As you can see, we also had Christian missionaries who interacted with these enslaved people as well, and consequently, Caribbean Creoles results. Because that's the nature of humans. You throw them together, they are going to communicate one way or the other. So this is not unique to human situations. Now, after Creoles developed, and we have Dr. Farquharson here, and in his writing in 2014, he posits that Creoles were developed about the mid-18th century. So there are other scholars who believed it could be the 19th century. Some more are saying it's the mid, like Dr. Farquharson, who through research, he was saying both white. So many times we say it was only the blacks who were speaking this language. But from his research, there were also Creole whites in the Caribbean who were also speaking these Creoles. Nevertheless, despite the development, Caribbean Creoles in the British West Indies were invisible for at least a century. So if you're saying 19th century, it would be a century, as you will see later. And if you're saying mid-18th, it would be a little more than that, but at least for a century. Now, there is one statement that was made that proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that these Creoles were not visible to most people. So if we look at Adams, who was the secretary of the Inter-University College for Higher Education in the colonies in 1950, which was just the other day, right? Just the other day, was saying that only in the West Indies, students were not learning through a foreign language. In other words, what he was saying was in Malaya, in Australia, in Africa, all of those countries, the students who were in those universities, the language that was the British, the English, was a foreign language to them. But in the British West Indies, which includes Jamaica, there was no foreign language. The students were learning only through English. And so this statement shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that Creoles were perceived as invisible. Can I tell you, even in the 21st century, as we'll see later, it is still invisible to some. Creoles are still invisible to some people. All right, so let us look at the process of recognizing or including Creoles in education. As I said to you before, between 1947, when the university was set up, and I don't know where my text disappeared from, because the 1947, there should be the University College of the West Indies and the University of the West Indies, or / University of the West Indies. Between 1947 and 1951, after it had been set up, Creoles were still invisible, because the blueprint that had been given to other colonial universities by the colonial powers and given to Jamaica still excluded any kind of specific reference to these Creoles. So, up to 1951, but interestingly, as my research revealed, you see those roots under that building. There were several poets, Caribbean poets, who during this period of seeming invisibility, were experimenting with the writing of Creole. So we had a Louise Bennett from like the late 1937 onwards who was writing poems in Creole. We had Claude McKay. We had Una Marson. So a lot of advocacy for Creole was taking place even as it remained invisible. And that is what I learned through my research, that even when things appear not to be happening, underneath everything, if a lot of things are happening intentionally, maybe unintentionally, but things are happening. In fact, what I discovered is that faith, F-A-T-E, was a big factor in how Creoles developed and where they are today. So as you can see, there was unexpected Creole recognition and advocacy. And I'm going to talk about Robert Brock LePage, who came to the university to teach. He was to teach, I think, ancient English or something, definitely not linguistics. But he developed an interest in listening to people speak Creole, and he started writing it down. And then he entered a competition, I think with the Gleaner, where he shared these Creole words, and then other people came on later, that like Frederick Cassidy and others who came in the picture. They lived, some of them at one point lived on Mona Commons, and they were meeting, they were talking about it, and so everything began to change. A lot of activities, the first linguistic conference, I think 1957, right? And things just started happening. And suddenly, Creoles became visible. So 1950, somebody says they don't exist. And by 1952, suddenly people wake up and these Creoles are around. And that awakening continued with Dennis Craig, Don Anderson, also the counterpart of Lawrence Carrington in Trinidad, and many others came in, and therefore they started doing projects with children in Jamaica, in Trinidad, all over. We had the LMW series, the language material workshops, and then in a little while there were many books, till we had the first curriculum written which had a Creole impact in Trinidad and Tobago in 1975. And by 1980, Jamaica had its first curriculum which referenced Creole. So suddenly, there was that awakening. And so you can see that all of these unexpected or unplanned events and Creole advocacy and Creole agency led to language education policies, because after Jamaica's policy in 2001, many other countries followed. And so over time, we had several policies, national curricula, even CXC, which references Creoles. And we can talk about the CAPE, which requires students to have knowledge of Creoles. We can talk about the recent SBA, which says you can include some Creoles in your oral presentation, even though it must be predominantly in English. So all of this has happened in, I would consider, a relatively short time. Creoles have become very visible. So I did talk about the foundations, the 1980 curriculum and the new primary school syllabus in Trinidad. So we're going to spend a little time now to look at the National Standards Curriculum, commonly referred to by its abbreviation, the NSC. But to do this, I would have to start with the policy that informed the curriculum. So as opposed to the ROSE and the revised primary curriculum that were written before the policy, so they happened in reverse. But what in this case, the policy fed into the NSC. But what I've learned about policy doesn't have to be written. Policy is what happens. So even though we didn't have a policy in place to inform the revised primary curriculum and the ROSE curriculum, all that happened before with Craig, all that happened with the 1980 curriculum influenced these other curricula. So if you look at the language policy of the draft language policy, I should say education policy, you will notice that it speaks about maintaining standard Jamaican English as the official language and promoting basic communication through the oral use of the home language in the early years, K to 3, and somewhere further in that policy, it also talks about grade 4. So whether grade 3 or grade 4, while facilitating the development of literacy in English. This we call a transitional policy, as you can see right here, that further down in the policy, it speaks about transitional bilingualism. So although Creole was being promoted in the early years, the expectation was that as students went to upper, further grade 5, grade 6, and into the secondary system, they would have become more proficient in the use of standard Jamaican English. So you can see there where it talks about flexibility in using the children's language to facilitate comprehension and using the communicative strategies and contrastive analysis to teach these students. Now I want to talk about the home language reference in the NSC. You will recognize later that this title, home language, is used across the Caribbean. So it's not unique to Jamaica. And it came into being in a framework in which it was transitional. So if you talk about home language, you're talking about a language that you come with, but it's not going to remain. Okay, if it's not a school language, it's a home language, it is temporary. Because you will be talking about what happens about in your home and other things. And when you have learned English, then you will use English to talk about these things. However, what I have noticed looking across curricula, even in the NSC, even where it is clearly going beyond a temporary language, the label home language is still maintained. Therefore, whenever we see home language in the curriculum, we should not interpret it as it would have been initially to be a temporary language, but just a title that is used to describe the Jamaican Creole or JC. So these are synonyms in the curriculum, and we have standard Jamaican English. And people will ask, why not just English? But I'm sure the linguists inside here can talk about the differences between the standard British English and the standard Jamaican English. One quick example that I always give my colleagues, I can give you. We will say cat in English. And we say that's English, and it's acceptable in standard Jamaican English. But if you go to Britain and say cat, the cat, they will right away know that, it's another English that you are speaking, because the cat is palatalized, what we say, the palatalization of the C, which is a feature of standard Jamaican English, which has some bearing coming from the Creole. And there are many other. People tell me all the while I say persons. They say that is something that characterizes Jamaicans. When we should say people, we say persons. And that is a feature of standard Jamaican English, which is a lexical feature that is acceptable in standard Jamaican English. So we go on. We now have a draft language education policy 2021 is the latest date. And when I look at that policy, I recognize that it has kept much of what was there before, with some updating of the data that is presented to show the language situation. You notice I've underlined the word facilitate. But if you go back to 2001, you will notice that the word promote is used. But now we have substituted that with the word facilitate. But everything else. Now, another big change was that in the 2001 draft, it was transitional bilingualism. Now this policy is saying additive bilingualism. So we're saying under transitional bilingualism, it's like you drop the Creole after a while and move on to English. But with the additive bilingualism, you are learning another language, but you're not letting go of your Creole. So you're keeping the Creole as a resource to enable learning. So I just wanted to point that out in the policy. And I want to now look at some examples of bilingualism in the NSC, how Creoles are used. And I'm sure there could be other categories, but I formulated these categories having looked at the attainment targets or general objectives and the objectives. Language and context. So this is how Creole is used to differentiate between language and context. Language awareness, distinguishing between Jamaican Creole and standard Jamaican English, and also language for impact. Now, by just looking at those categories, we are seeing that Creole is not just a passing thing, but it is functioning in the curriculum in categories that maybe in the past we were not paying attention to. So, as you can see here, in the NSC, we have what are called attainment targets, which is just another name for general objectives. I should point out that the framework that we used to develop the curriculum had standards, attainment targets, and benchmarks. However, for language, we have retained only the attainment targets in the actual guide, because in the revised primary curriculum and that preceded the NSC, they used attainment targets and the objectives, and we wanted it to be easier for teachers. So we didn't want to confuse the teachers with too many new terminologies, so we retained attainment targets and objectives. However, for some subject areas like mathematics, if you see standards and benchmarks, don't think it's strange. They have retained some of those from the framework. So you notice with the listening and speaking, the context here speaks about communicating for different purposes and audiences using SJE and JC appropriately and creatively. So here, the students are expected to determine what it is that is important, what is relevant to the situation, and to select the language that is appropriate. Language awareness, another attainment target, and I should point out to you that in the National Standards curriculum, the attainment targets go across the areas, the subject areas, with few exceptions. So from grade 1 straight to grade 9, you will see some of these same attainment targets. What makes the difference are the objectives that are pitched at a different level. So this one tells shows that the students have to be making distinctions between home language and standard Jamaican language to improve and or acquire language and literacy competencies. For impact, you notice that here it is looking at how speakers use the language. So the student is expected to comment on how the speakers use Jamaican Creole. How is it impacting them? Also, you notice it talks about language choices, making language choices. So the student has to decide, which one do I use? So if I want to make, for example, talk about a character that is authentic, do I use Creole to make the character authentic? So these are just some of the ways in which Jamaican Creole is used in the listening and speaking strand. Now, when you look at writing, you notice here that the attainment target requires that the student writes to narrate, to persuade, for a range of transactional purposes, and they are to use SJE and JC appropriately. Now somebody may say, boy, you said oral use of Creole, and now I'm seeing writing of Creole. Why is there writing? But the fact that it says appropriately tells us that the expectation is that the child will not, for example, based on the policy, use Creole for narration. but the child can use Creole for dialogue, for example, which is what happens in CXC. They tell you that the dialect, Creole, which they call the dialect, is allowed in the dialogue, but it is not allowed in the narration. And this other one says, use and adapt a range of sentence structures according to context, distinguishing between standard Jamaican English and Jamaican Creole. But what I find, and this process was very useful to me as a curriculum developer, because as I stepped back from our work, I realized that even though we have these attainment targets, by and large, the emphasis was placed on English when we went to the objectives and when we went to the activities. So the role of JC, when you operationalize it, it is more implicit than explicit. So a teacher now would have to say to the students, no, that is a JC structure. That is not English, but it is not explicit within the curriculum. Okay, so here we look at some specific objectives. So we just looked at the attainment targets, and you can look now to see how these are operationalized in actual objectives, which are narrower than the targets. So you can take a look at them. You notice we have under impact code switching, right? We also have the functions of different language forms in a speaker's presentation. So when a child can actually look at a video with somebody making a speech who uses Creole and determine if it is impactful or not, if the language choice was a good choice or not. When you look at awareness, you notice that I have put a link between context and awareness, because the student's choice of a language for the context is determined by their awareness of the language. What does the language consist of, and what can it do? Now you notice that in dual language use, this is where students are allowed to freely use any language choice. So for example, at grade 1, where children are just learning English, the students are allowed to speak clearly and concisely using both standard Jamaican English and Jamaican Creole. And this was found not only in the language curriculum, but also in the integrated studies for 1 to 3, which is a combination of science, social studies, math. All those areas are in the integrated studies, and the students are allowed to speak freely in any language at that point. And it says here in the second objective under dual language use, it does not say what language, but it is implied, because it says students talk freely. And the fact that they're speaking freely means that they are not inhibited so much by their language choice. Again, this is at grade 1. So generally, what I found as I prepared for this topic, that in 7 to 9, you have a better breakout of the Jamaican, the bilingual impact across objectives and even in activities, more than in the lower grades where literacy is being achieved. So the JC is embedded in the attainment targets, but less defined in the objectives and the activities, as opposed to grades 7 to 9, which does a very good job of that. So here, I just show you what an alignment of JC, SJE looks like with the objectives versus the attainment targets and the objectives. And this was taken from the integrated studies. So you see that students are using home language or standard Jamaican English to talk about themselves and their experiences. They are using it to talk about how they take care of their bodies. But again, they are responding to questions in standard Jamaican English. So there is that restriction. So at grade 7 here, just showing you a sample bilingual activity where the students watch a television program on national events, and they look to see how the speakers use Standard Jamaican English, or JC. They contrast this program with other programs. So it's that sort of thing that the students will do as they evaluate the appropriateness of the language that is used. And we know in the media nowadays there are many examples of Jamaican Creole being used, so the teacher can find those examples. Now, so that is the NSC in a nutshell. Now, if we move to Trinidad and Tobago talks about Creole English and Standard English, which is a little different from Jamaica. As we notice, they have not used a unique title for their Standard English. It's just Standard English. And even though it's Creole, English is appended to it. Now, we know that in the British West Indies, we have English-based Creoles, but nevertheless, the title somehow points us to the importance of English even in the Creole. And it says here that students with Creole English as their first language are scaffolded to read in Standard English. Again, we see the transitional model in operation, that the focus is on English as opposed to two separate languages functioning. But Creole is a means to an end, which is to help children to develop their competencies in English. So just a quick comparison across the Caribbean. Looking at the status of Creole, Trinidad and Tobago talks about English and Creole English. Jamaica, as we said before, speaks to JC, home language, and Standard Jamaican English. In Guyana, which has several Arawakan and Carib indigenous languages, uses the blanket term home language. Now, we spoke earlier about the implications of home language, that it is something that appears to be restricted to a certain domain, right, which is things relating to the home. But as I said earlier, home language is now becoming just a synonym for the Creole and not necessarily signaling a language which does anything, which can do other things. All right, the Bahamas. I found that of the different countries that I looked at, the Bahamas, all right, I'll come to the listening and speaking for the Bahamas, but they call Creole the dialect, common D, informal language, and they speak of Standard English as a formal language. Barbados speaks about the native language and Standard English. So if we just look at the lineup here, Jamaica stands out as the country that has given its unique brand to its languages as opposed to the other countries. Now, when you look at listening and speaking, all the countries to some extent encourage the use of Jamaican Creole in the oral form, which is consistent with what Craig had originally said for the Caribbean countries in the British West Indies. Craig spoke to monoliterate transitional bilingualism, which is starting out with Creole and moving to Standard English. The later Craig saw Creole as a resource, because Craig later in the 2006 version of Craig's work showed that Craig was saying use Creole for conceptual development throughout the child's education and not just in the early years. So, as I said, Barbados talks about transitioning from the oral proficiency in the native language to full competence in Standard English. So just looking at it, right across the globe, Jamaica and all of these countries, we see that the listening and speaking is where we have most of the Creole input, but it is very transitional in nature. When you look at writing and grammar, we see where in Trinidad and Tobago, they talk about an explicit awareness of English Creole and Standard English in patterns in their writing. But again, when you went through the guides, you didn't see any specific activity or anything to develop this particular standard. For Jamaica, as I shared earlier, we have used and adapt these sentences under the writing strand that are in Creole. However, when we looked in many cases at the activities, these were not really fleshed out and operationalized. For the Bahamas, we could not find any activity per se that addressed writing. So for Bahamas, we're seeing that the monoliterate transitional model is in full effect, because Bahamas had a lot of listening, and they have rather, a lot of listening and speaking objectives and activities. I think of all the country, Bahamas fleshes out the activities the best way. But in all these activities, the focus is on context. What is appropriate? You use Creole on the playground. You use it when you're talking to friends. But when you're speaking to adults or when you're in the classroom, you speak English. So for Bahamas, the focus is clearly transitional, and that is why it does not include writing. Writing could not be found. For Barbados, Barbados speaks to discriminating between dialect and standard usage according to place and circumstance. So for Barbados, that was just that statement. But again, when you looked within the activities and when you looked on the specific objectives, the focus was primarily on English with little or no focus on the standard Jamaican English. On the Creole operationalization. So in Guyana here, we saw a reading activity that says provide learners with a My New Word journal. And interestingly, it tells the students that they are to add words that include both the home language and English. So this is something that I did not find in other curricula, which stood out in the Guyanese curriculum as really taking a proactive step to really use the Jamaican language in a context outside of listening and speaking. Also in Guyana for writing, I found this particular statement that says learners use a combination of home languages, because remember they have a variety of Arawakan and Carib languages. They use a combination of these languages and English to share their ideas in writing. So Guyana is seen to be the most progressive of the different Caribbean countries in terms of how it uses its Creole outside of the oral use. When you look at Jamaica, Jamaica seems to be the leader with the oral part of Creole, while other countries will reference the Creole, but they are not mentioned anywhere else. So after you see some targets or general objectives, that's the end of them. Now, what is the big picture? So I will be looking at the big picture as it relates to Creole and the way forward. So what we are seeing, how I started with the invisibility of Creoles, speeding up. When I look at the invisibility of Creoles, where we're coming from and where we are, I'm seeing 72 years. 72 years of progress. And that 72 years, we know that in the real state of affairs, for those who are very young, 72 years seem like you're really old, right? But for those of us who know how time passes, 72 years is a relatively short time to see the kind of progress that we have seen in Creole languages. So I would say for the big picture that Creole languages have been, there has been significant movement in the recognition of Creole languages across the Caribbean. Mrs. Kelly spoke to inclusivity, and that is one of the things that I registered, that the use of Creoles, the recognition even on a superficial level, is really something to be commended, that in our formal documents, our policies and our curriculum documents, we are including Creoles. I need to point out, however, that despite this apparent inclusivity, when we look at the reality of what happens in schools, many teachers do not pay much attention to the listening and the speaking component. And that's where we have most of the Creole input. So what happens is that because despite the intentions of the curriculum, because we have a kind of, we know exams are important, right? And what assessed gets taught. So when you look at the primary level where we're not testing, listening, and speaking, when you go up, for example, to upper primary, people will put the listening and speaking aside. And what we try to say to them, listening and speaking has to be intentional. It is not just to say, I talk and you listen. There are specific skills to be taught, specific objectives to be met. And so, in terms of Creoles in curricula, I would say that's an area that is lagging behind despite its density in the curriculum. So the aim is to have, as we move forward in curriculum development, is to ensure that people are paying attention to the listening and the speaking component. And so of all these, therefore, Guyana could be seen as the most progressive in terms of their curriculum. What Shondell Nera 2011 found in a study that she did in 3 Jamaican schools, however, that despite the fact that some teachers were saying, I don't like Creole, I don't use it, when she observed them, they were using it. To teach. The same people who say, I don't like Creole, and they were using it for conceptual development. And when we look at our 2021 draft language education policy, it lines up with this, using Creole for conceptual development. And some of our teachers are already doing this, so I would consider it a kind of bottom-up policy. What is the way forward for Jamaican Creole? I believe that when I look at our 2021 policy, even though it retains most of the 2001, and when I look at the Caribbean, it looks like we are all poised for further development in the use of Creole. And with the SBA, English SBA, including Creole, we will find that other teachers will start using that even at the secondary level. But the problem is we're saying to teachers, don't wait until grade 10 or grade 9 to start looking at these things, because, from grade 1 straight up to grade 9, we have these objectives and these things in the curriculum that can help students. But by the time they get to 10 and 11, they would have understood not just Creole, but the dynamics of oral presentation and all those things that are included in the curriculum. And our language attitude survey that was done, I think, 2006 by the JLU, as well as my study, which included qualitative and quasi-quantitative work, shows that we are indeed progressing in terms of Creoles in education. Thank you. And as you can see, references about how, persons who have been speaking about. Here I go with persons again, people who have been using my standard Jamaican English. All right. I will be the one fielding the questions. Are there any questions at this time? Go ahead. Okay. Please go ahead. Questions? Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. McLean Francis, for your presentation.
You are most welcome.
I did learn some things today, especially as it relates to the national standards curriculum and what other countries are doing. My question, the first one is, was it a deliberate effort to not explicitly include the use of Creole? I noticed that throughout your presentation you make mention of it's implicit. Was that a deliberate effort
at the lower levels, and to have it more explicit at the grades 7 to 9?
I do not think it was, as in a lot of, as I said, policy, I realize a lot of it is unintentional. I do not think anybody deliberately set out not to flesh that out, but I think the lenses through which people looked at things. So I think that writers and general, as I say, I'm a part of the process, looked at the developmental process through the lenses of the policy. The 2001 policy, which has an end point of achieving literacy in standard English. And therefore, I think in that regard, people are just saying, okay, the teachers will help the students who have the Creole problems as they learn the English. But I honestly, from where I sit, don't think that there was any agenda, you didn't use that word, or any specific aim not to flesh that out at that level. I think it was intentional. Unintentional. Okay. And for 7 to 9, I think maybe the awareness of the syllabus and other things maybe drove people to pay more attention to being more specific, you know, when they thought of CXC and other things, and students can handle it at that level. Yes.
Should I go ahead with my follow-up?
Sure.
All right. So the second one, because I'm a little uncomfortable with the implicit nature of the inclusion of Creole.
Right.
But, all right, it wasn't intentional.
Yes.
Based on the changes to the NSC.
Yes.
Are there systems in place? Because you yourself just said that some teachers said they don't like Creole. Yes, they use it with the students, but to achieve the specific targets, that you're hoping for, are there systems in place to guide teachers through this? Or is it just do what you're comfortable with?
Not at all. There are, in fact, systems in place because we have a monitoring arm, my unit being one of them, that we support teachers in the implementation. It is only just that, as I said, when you go and you see a lesson and you review, in more cases than not, you will not find a listening and speaking lesson. And that's the area where the bulk of the Creole inclusion is. But people, in their minds, think that listening and speaking is incidental, and that is something we have been trying to get our teachers to do. So even when we work with teachers who teach both CSEC and lower grades, we say to them, listen, it's an intentional thing. It's not incidental, and if you do this, then your students will be better at it when they get to the CSEC SBA, when they get to the Cape, it will be much easier for them to manage. And generally, I usually say to people, teaching English in a Creole speaking or predominantly Creole speaking environment requires certain competencies that are outside of the traditional methodologies and approaches. For example, when you listen to, I realize that a lot of people will be reading, the person with the Creole background, and they will eat off the inflectional endings. So they will pronounce the root, but they will ignore that. And you might say, boy, they can't read. But again, somebody should know that somebody learning English in a Creole speaking environment, the emphasis should be placed on certain areas. And so these are some of the things we try to bring to the attention of teachers. And it is our hope that over time, the listening and speaking component will become a more attractive area for people until we wait for policy to evolve to include more of the strands. Right.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand over to someone else.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much. You had mentioned earlier in your talk about Creole being allowed when students are doing CSEC English.
Yes.
And actually, I have my younger son who's currently doing CSEC English, and he kind of surprised me when he came home and said, oh, I have to do an English oral.
Yes.
Like, say what now?
That's the SBA, yes.
Right. Because, yeah, I mean, he's doing Spanish, so yeah, Spanish oral.
Yes.
Where are we going with this English oral thing? So when you said earlier that it is being incorporated, I don't know if you could flesh out a little bit more.
And that has been for a number of years
Right,
now.
right.
I think from 2018, I don't want to misquote the time of the syllabus, but this SBA has been in for it has been several years now. And part of the oral presentation, because if you look in the objectives of the English syllabus, you know they speak to Creole awareness and that sort of thing. But by and large, it's not treated in any fulsome way. You know, we really focus on English. But in terms of the SBA, at least the existing one, because the syllabus was recently reviewed, so I don't know what it looks like now. But the existing syllabus allows students, so that a student can choose to use only English for your oral presentation if you like. But if you like, you can also include Creole. But again, when the student includes the Creole, the rubric would be looking at the appropriateness. So that same contextual use, the appropriateness of the Creole will be considered. So it won't be an illy-nilly inclusion, but it will be an inclusion that makes characters authentic, for example, and give life to something or so you inject some Creole, but predominantly it would be English. So that's the SBA, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I spoke to about in the narrative, the students are allowed to use Creole in the dialogue for CSEC English. Yes.
A couple questions. The first is your name, because I was under the impression you were. Yes, I was under the impression, and I addressed you as Francis McLean, and then I hear everybody else say it the other way around.
So it's the other way around, but it doesn't bother me too much. I don't get flustered. So people call me Mrs. McLean, Mrs. Francis McLean, or anything they call me, I'll answer.
All right.
So it doesn't really matter.
But I want to get it right. So
it's McLean Francis.
McLean Francis. All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd love to hear your opinion on the CAPE, specifically the Communication Studies syllabus, because at that level, we are not just encouraging students to write the dialogue.
Right, it goes beyond that.
There you go. If they wish to write the narrative in Creole, they are perfectly allowed to do that, but we do require them to justify.
Right.
Why have you selected this particular dialectal variety for this particular audience? So I'm kind of interested to hear your views on what is happening. I don't know the extent to which you are familiar with the CAPE Communication Studies, but
yes,
I'd love to hear your views on that.
Well, my views on it, it again authenticates the use of the curriculum at the lower ends, because you're looking at language awareness, you're looking at structures, you know, the morphology, the phonology, all of that is being addressed in the curriculum at primary, moving into the secondary, to up to grade 10, you know, 10 and 11. Or our curriculum stops at grade 9, but we give oversight to 10 and 11. So we are saying that if teachers are really paying attention to what is in the curriculum, by the time they get to CAPE, it wouldn't be foreign to them, because the language awareness, the contrastive analysis that is embedded at different levels would fit them for that. I mean, admittedly, they would have to go beyond some of the rudimentary aspects of what they would have done at the lower levels, but they would have had a firm base if they do that. So that is why we encourage teachers to look into the curriculum and utilize the curriculum.
Thanks very much. I'm going to allow someone else.
You're most welcome.
Come in.
Add something to what Dr. Telfer said.
Yes.
She asked how much, I think, that's what I got from it, how much emphasis is being placed on making these teachers aware. Are you just simply monitoring them, or are you actually training?
Yes.
As one of the people who in the early years, early long time, was responsible for the Rose curriculum. I know that the ministry had some quick training, like, 2 little days here and 2 little days there, and the teachers were sent out to follow the structures and to do some of what you had up there, which were in the Rose curriculum. About 3 years later, I did some research on what had happened to the Rose. It was almost dead. Because the teachers had not been fully trained in the use of the curriculum, and they were not aware of how to make transitions and how to use it. Now, unless we do that with this new standards curriculum, it's just going to die like the others.
Well,
And so I want that. And my second question is, if we are insisting or if we're going to be asking students to use Creole writing, are we teaching them the writing system, or are we just using chaka-chaka English?
Okay, the first question about training. So we have recognized as a ministry that one-shot training does not work. So we have been doing ongoing training, both on what we recognize as the different units who monitor what we see, and we will do training as per what we call QECs, geographic regions, or we will do them by, just a set of schools or individual schools. And so we are moving away from that one model of training teachers. But as I said before, and as Shondell Nero found in her work of the schools, that a lot of focus, the examinations, really, that's where the focus begins. And we will know that even in some schools as early as grade 7, the examinations rule. And so, although we may have listening and speaking in the SBA, some people are not realizing that if you start early and you do what the curriculum says and that sort of thing. But from our end, that is something we try to plug in to say to teachers, guess what? You love the writing strand. I know that the grammar and conventions, those are important to you because those will help the students to pass the examinations. But we implore them and we advise them up to this week. We're saying to a school, ensure that the different strands are covered, and we try to show them that it's not incidental. But I take your point, and that is one of the areas that the ministry wishes to tighten up on, how we give ongoing support, and that is being done via different interventions. The second question is about, slipped me.
If we're asking them to write in the Creole, are we asking them to do it in the correct writings, using the correct writing
So as you
system?
saw from my presentation, the area of writing in general is very sparse across the Caribbean, given the focus on the transitional model. And even the revised policy that speaks to additive bilingualism and talks about opportunistic writing to aid the learning of English, that has not, because as I said, it's a 2001 policy that drove the NSC, right? And that was transitional. So we'll have to wait for another curriculum now that would be aligned to that. In terms of the writing system, truthfully, that we have not been implementing a specific orthography for Creole. It is still what you call the chaka-chaka for the time being. But hopefully, as a ministry, we'll move to standardization in that area. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Farkas.
Okay, thanks, Dr. McLean Francis. So I'd first like to follow up on Mrs. Kelly's question.
Yes.
And I'm glad it seems that you are the right person to say this. And it will allow me to state publicly that if the ministry is interested in, a systematic, ongoing training for teachers, the Jamaican language unit, which has, and I think you know this, piloted bilingual education, that we do have a program ready on dual language or multilingual practice in education. So if at any time the ministry is ready to talk, we are available to talk on that. My real question, though, was what would you say to those people who say that the ministry is supporting slackness, is encouraging confusion and anarchy, because we now seem to be moving in a direction of people supporting this Creole thing? Aren't we supposed to be learning English? So what's happening here in our curriculum?
Okay, so I wouldn't say that the ministry is supporting slackness, and I'm genuinely saying this, not just because I'm a part of the ministry. But as we looked at, that's where when I started from the invisibility and where we are now, frankly speaking, I think we have achieved a lot amidst persons or people who are hell-bent on eradicating Creole, because we still have that in some pockets where people will say, if you teach my child Creole in school, my child not coming back to your school, and we have all that sort of thing still going on. And amidst all of that, we have been able to achieve, at least in policy, because the curriculum is still part of policy, at the policy level, we have in fact achieved a lot. And based on my research, I am confident that the same FATE that allowed us to move from nothing to this greatness across the Caribbean, especially in countries that have been known to be more Creole resistant, and where we are now today, I think we have come a long way, and I am sure we will go ahead. So we just have to keep educating people. And when I looked at the language education policy, not written by Novlet, I think that it is very enlightening. When I looked at it, I smiled and I say, we are in fact moving ahead. The implementation requires more work, but I think it will only get better.
I just wanted to ask, is there a deliberate attempt to integrate Creole in the curriculum? Because I know at the higher level, the policy level, it seems to be there, and there are nice words there and so on. But I know that the language unit had some years ago done a pilot project.
A bilingual project.
And I thought that this was going to lead into, and from what I heard, it was successful.
It was.
And so I wonder what has happened to that, whether there is any intention of, integrating Creole into the system so that it's not just something that people decide that they want to do or not do, but it's part of what they have to do.
Okay. So thank you for that. So in terms of the curriculum, the expectation is that the curriculum will be in fact implemented. But that's another thing, as we say, despite the problem. In terms of another project, which would not be the mainstream curriculum implementation, which we are trying to do via what is written down, I cannot speak to those policy decisions from where I sit, so that's a bigger decision. But I do know, in fact, that the Bilingual Education Project 2004 to 2008 was very successful. It achieved its aim by showing that children suffered no harm, both non-project and project, and boys had a specific benefit. The boys in the project outperformed their peers, both in the project and outside of the project. But where we will go from there as to full Creole bilingualism, learning through Creole and writing it and doing everything, and then because they also did English as well, so it was fully bilingual. That's a decision for the senior policy level. And I'm sure with further talks, they'll make a decision, but I can't speak definitively to that from where I sit.
I just wondered if I'd missed it.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yes.
Me again.
Yes, Doctor.
I just want to pull on a thread that Joseph had teased out of the tapestry regarding the preparation and the training of teachers. And I speak specifically in the context of the CAPE communication studies. There is a perceived need, an actual and perceived need on the part of teachers that they need training to deliver the language and community module 2.
Yes.
And whenever I talk to the teachers in the area, that is the module that they feel they need the greatest help with.
Right.
But I also remember speaking to maybe your predecessor twice removed about what is it that the ministry can do for these teachers, and unfortunately nothing happened. And of course, when you speak to CXC, I remember one of the officers saying, we are an exam syndicate, we are not the Ministry of Education, which means, and in all fairness to them, they have had workshops for teachers since then. But I wonder the help that the ministry can give to teachers. And maybe you can't speak to this because you know this might be.
But this is something I can feed to my deputy chief, who heads the curriculum division, and she can feed it up to say there is a specific need regarding CAPE, and let's see where we go from there.
Right.
So leaving this session, if she's still watching, she's not tired, I'm sure she's hearing what we are saying, but I will still directly make this request,
right.
that there is that specific need.
And in the context of what Joseph is offering, you know, I'm not his PR or anything, but the need is there. The need is there.
Yes,
Right.
and I agree. Because even when I was in the classroom, yes, I heard teachers saying, boy, then come with on something in CAPE. Linguistics, it a kill we.
Yeah.
So I concur that there is a need. Who should?
If I may, we have a question in the chat. All right, so Michelle Stewart McCoy online, she says, interesting. Her question is, as education systems move towards concepts of diversity, inclusion, equity, and equality, will teaching and assessment consider responses solely in Jamaican?
That's a big move. And so I will say I have a dream, right? But it is in fact a big move, but not something, if we look at the leap from 1950 to 52, it may just happen soon. And when you look at the Guyanese curriculum, for example, great things are happening there in terms of writing. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. But nevertheless, it is an exemplar of sorts that is held up to us to say, hey, this has some value, right? Yes, thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Doc, for that fine presentation. Tell me something, when you were deliberating, giving the presentation, was there any thought running through your mind that you were going to intersperse some Creole in your presentation?
It ran through my mind and I don't know why I didn't, but you got a little a while ago, didn't you? Yeah. You got a little a while ago. Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm very sorry, Doc, that I missed part of your presentation, but there's a question that I have in relation to educational practice and language in Jamaica.
Yeah.
I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that students from abroad, say the Chinese and the Indians, when they have to do exams, they're given some assistance with language.
Yes.
Now, that brings a kind of complication in terms of going back to the question that Mrs. Stewart McCoy raised about equity in relation to the Jamaican Creole speaker entering an education system where a foreigner who doesn't speak English is being assisted to do an exam in a second language, and the Jamaican Creole speaker is being forced to use English. Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, sure. So it is reminiscent of Adams that I cited. So there is a sort of blindness, what you call, or invisibility when we come to the examinations. I concur. So the same way Adams was saying, these people in Africa and India and other places, English is foreign to them. But for you in the British West Indies, it's just English everybody learning. And I think, admittedly, when we look at the scenario that you just shared, we are still seeing, we are not seeing our situation as being a situation similar to that of the Chinese. But I should point out to you, however, that for like the PEP, we have shadows who work with students who are perceived to have certain special needs, but we have never thought of students who are only Creole speakers struggling to learn English and the implications. So that is a very interesting question that you have raised, and something I can't give you the final answer again, but it is something to be discussed at another level.
Right, it would make a very interesting case for our courts.
Yes. And that, we know there was a case, there was an article about a Jamaican, I think it was in England, who had to get an interpreter because they weren't getting anywhere with him. So they had to get an interpreter. So it made the case. So thank you for that input. Something to be discussed as we talk about inclusion, inclusivity. All right. I will now hand back to our masters of ceremonies. Thank you.
We'd like to extend thanks to our keynote speaker, Dr. Novelet McLean-Francis, on the insightful presentation on the topic From Colonialism to the 21st Century, Creoles in Caribbean National Curriculum. Please give her a round of applause one more time. Her presentation focused on how the Ministry of Education and Youth is actively involving Jamaican Creole in the national standard curriculum.
At this time, we would like to express gratitude to our sponsors, LASCO distributors, and Wisinco.
We now invite Dr. Earl Dean Shakespeare to make a presentation to our honoree, Mrs. Pamela Kelly.
And with that said, Mrs. Kelly, mine is a pleasure to present to you these lovely tokens on behalf of the team from the center that I would say you birthed. So the branches stand to salute. And so we thank you so very much, and we hope that this one will defy the odds. And in another 10 years, you will tell us that she survived. Yes. Yes, and in case I saw something the other day where they said, don't just run and administer medication to your plants. Take a picture of the plant, upload it, ask the internet to tell you what type of plant and what type of treatment it might need based on the symptoms, and then you'd be so advised. So now you have doctor online. I don't know if it's AI aided or just Google, but something will help you keep her alive. And so I will lift this one, just to be sure, because I know this one won't fall, and say thank you so very much.
And I say thank you to Earldine and to everyone for this token. And they don't all die. I have one or two over 10 years.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Shakespeare and Mrs. Kelly. We also invite Ms. Shalika Boris to make a presentation to our keynote speaker, Mrs. McLean-Francis.
Dr. Novlet. Another name, all right? Yes. So on behalf of everybody here, we just want to express our sincere gratitude to you for taking the time to present, this interesting and always lively conversation with us. We appreciate your presentation, very insightful, and I personally learned, right? I'm always a fan of Creoles, but I certainly learned from it, and I'm sure everybody else did. So on behalf of the LTRC team, we'd like to present you with these tokens. We hope that you will enjoy them and use them.
Thank you.
All right. You are most welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Boris and Mrs. Francis. At this time, Dr. Telfer, Director of the Language Teaching and Research Center, will be coming to make a presentation and express gratitude to all contributors.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Shakespeare and Miss Boris. I laid hands on them suddenly just now, and I appreciate that. All right, so before I just call a list of persons that Novlet, that I wish to thank, I would like to first thank my MCs with a gift. These are two students from our Bachelor of Arts in Communication Arts and Technology program who just last week decided to host this session for us. And I am sure you agree that they did an awesome job. So I just want to gift them with a little something. I can't carry both at once. And I again want to thank Lasco Distributors and Wisinco for our beautiful gift baskets. Yes. Oops. Dr. Lewis, I should ask you to do the honors for me, So these are two of Dr. Lewis's students from its professional voice and speech, Dr. Lewis. Yes. So we have to big up Dr. Lewis, Anyone?
A wonderful job. Yes?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. So we are almost there. I know we're over time, so I won't keep you very long, but I must thank a number of persons who, who made today possible, all right? I want to start with our guest lecturer, Dr. McLean Francis. When I reached out to her about doing the lecture, there was no hesitation. She said, yes, I'll do it, right? And she did a wonderful job. We all learned. It was informative, it was educational, and it was motivational, all right? So we want to thank you very much for taking the time to present our 10th Pamela Kelly lecture, 10 years. Thank you, Dr. McLean Francis. All right, we also would like to thank all the persons on the program people on the program, starting with Dr. Lativadair, our head of school, newly minted, head of school, who opened the program in style as usual. We thank Dr. McDermott. You know, we can't have Dr. McDermott do a talk without some kind of literary reference, right? So we appreciate you bringing greetings on behalf of the faculty. Dr. Shakespeare, right? We have been trying to pull Dr. Shakespeare in to introduce Miss Kelly. I know for last year, unfortunately she couldn't do it, but I thought this year it must be done because this is a big year. I'm very happy that you were able to do that for us. We appreciate it. Mrs. K, you don't know. You don't know. All right, Mrs. Kelly has been and will forever be one of us. She still gives advice to so many, right? I'm planning to call her after this to discuss a project. But Mrs. Kelly, we appreciate you. We cannot say how much we appreciate you. We can only hope that through this lecture each year, you get to feel a part of what we feel, all right? So thank you so much for always joining us and giving some witty remarks. Ms. Burris, thank you for a very well done introduction of the guest speaker. I'm sure by the time you finished, everybody wanted to hear what Dr. McLean Francis wanted to say. So thank you so much for that. And in addition to that, I must thank Miss Pencil. Can't leave her out. She has been the one, see her right around there? Yes. She has been the one spearheading this lecture for quite some time now, budding me up here and there. So thank you, Miss Pencil, for your efforts. We appreciate it. We also wish to thank the BACAT technical team. No, man, you have to clap a little louder. Thank you. Which includes our BACAT students. Since we came back last year, post-COVID, we have been trying the hybrid lecture, so to try to reach as many persons as possible. So, and they have been instrumental in helping us to achieve that. So we really, really appreciate the support. Thank you very much. And please, I saw Lennox earlier. Please also thank him for us. Mr. Horatio Williams from the library is here every year to record the event. So we thank you, sir. The UTech Marketing and Corporate Communications team for helping us to promote and to present the event. To our sponsors again, who helped us to be able to, I think, nicely gift our presenter and Mrs. Kelly. We say a big thank you. And in case I leave out to the faculty, in case I leave out anybody else, all right? Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's a yearly event, so next year again, all right? I hand over to Miss Dezoni and Mr. Wilson. I always messing up her name, right? To close out for us.
As we come to the end of our insightful and impactful lecture, let the conversations raised here resonate in our minds. As our keynote speaker mentioned, we are progressing as it relates to Jamaican Creole in education, and we are all poised for the further development of Jamaican Creole in education. I am Janelle Dezoni.
And I am Omar Wilson.
It has been a pleasure guiding you through this exploration of words and their diverse pathways. Safe journeys ahead.